Well, welcome back to the Steve Max Muscle Car Show podcast. We are now sponsored by High Octane Classics, the Northeast's largest muscle car and supercar dealership located at 143rd Washington Street in Auburn, Massachusetts, also known as 143 Washington Street in Auburn, Mass. High Octane Classics buys and sells and services muscle cars and exotics. You can call them at 508-859-4515. Hey, this is Steve Maggs, or Steve Magnante, you choose, and you're tuned into the Steve Maggs Muscle Car Show, the only podcast to bring you knowledge without the drivel. On this episode, we'll explore what kind of spare tires came in 1982 Camaros, the very special rear shock absorbers fitted to the Monte Carlo SS454, and how the 1963 Impala Z11 combated brake fade, and a whole lot more. Let's hit the road. Okay, let's begin the show with fact number 67 from my book, Steve Magnante's 1001 Muscle Car Facts. Again, this is the General Motors chapter with Chevrolet being highlighted. Here we go. Second generation Camaro gas tank started out at 18 gallons in 1970 through 73, then grew to 21 gallon capacity from 1974 through 1981. The extra capacity either gave the impression of improved fuel economy or added a little extra pain at the pump. Third generation Camaro gas tank shrank to 16 gallons, but since fuel economy was improved significantly, especially when the 151 cube four-banger was specified, overall range was unaffected. So there you have it. Second gen Camaros started out with 18-gallon tanks, but grew another 3 gallons in 1974. And I wouldn't be too surprised if that extra gallonage was done to give the impression of longer trips between stops at the gas tank or gas pump. Perhaps to give a psychological sense that, hey, my Camaro's not that bad on gas. Keep in mind, in the 1970s, early 70s, gasoline went over the $1 per gallon mark for the first time in history. And a lot of Americans freaked out. Now, here's the thing. Today, in 2020, I'm jumping ahead here. I wish it was 2021. 2020 is not such a great year so far, but let's not get stuck on that. But today, of course, in 2020, cars get such good fuel economy, and gasoline is still well under $3 a gallon, like $2.10. So really, to pay $1 a gallon back in 1970, it seemed like a shock, but it really was still quite a bargain. But anyway, when the gas tank shrank in 1982 for the third generation car down to 16 gallons, it must have seemed like a step backwards. But again, those cars were physically smaller, so they probably didn't have the space to handle the larger 22-gallon or 21-gallon tanks of the Gen 2 Camaro. But anyway, that's the story on gas tanks in Camaros. It's a bouncing ball. Okay, more Camaro tech in fact number 68. The one-year appearance of the optional JL8 four-wheel disc brakes on 1969 Camaros fed rumors of widespread availability in second-generation Camaros from 1970 through 81. It never happened. But Chevrolet made up for the omission with the third-generation Camaro in 1982. For a modest $179, RPO J65 replaced the standard 9.5-inch rear drum brakes with 10.5-inch vented rotors and low-drag iron calipers, which took a mere 195 feet to stop from 70 miles per hour. Though most J65 four-wheel disc brake assemblies went under Z28s, the Mega brakes were optional on all Camaros except for four-cylinder base models. So it's true, if you bought a Camaro Berlinetta with a 2.8 V6, you could get four-wheel disc brakes after 1982 for a mere $179. But it is funny, though. We know that, of course, in 1969, those four-wheel disc brake Camaros, the JL8s, are collector gold these days. But for 1970, for unknown reasons, Chevrolet did not continue four-wheel disc brakes on the second-gen Camaro. Would have been fantastic. But over at Pontiac, we got to remember that I think it was 1979 that the Trans Am and certain formulas could be had with four-wheel disc brakes. So Pontiac beat Chevrolet to the four-wheel disc brake punch by a couple of years. And yes, in 1982, the third-generation Firebird also came with optional four-wheel disc brakes, putting them equal with Camaro in the third-gen camp. Okay, let's move from brakes to spare tires with fact number 69, which reads, 1982 Camaros came with one of two varieties of spare tire, a small diameter collapsible donut or a skinny large diameter pizza cutter. The deciding factor was whether the car was built with a G80 limited slip differential. If so equipped, the tall, skinny spare tire was used because it was of similar diameter to the road wheels spinning on the other end of the axle. This maintained equal wheel speed to preserve the clutch plates in the posi unit. Camaros built with open differentials got the collapsible spare because the differential spider gears were not affected by unequal tire diameters. So there you have it. If you got G80 posi in your Camaro, regardless of whether it was a 4-cylinder or a Z28, you got a tall spare tire, a full-size spare tire. And it was of minimal consequence, except if you used the hatchback for storing things. That big spare tire was more in the way. If you got an open differential, well, that compact donut spare was much less intrusive for the baggage and groceries you could otherwise put under the glass hatchback. Okay, let's move back a couple of decades to the early 60s. Fact number 70 reads, beneath every SoFine 409 lies a most unusual two-piece driveshaft configuration. Originally devised to allow a lower driveshaft tunnel and floor pan on the longer, lower, wider, full-size 1958 Chevy models, the tubular shaft is divided into two halves, linked in the middle by a splined coupler and support bearing. The two short tubes offer greater torsional strength than a conventional one-piece tubular shaft, and the layout works great, as long as the center support is in good shape. This two-piece affair is used under all 1958 through 64 Chevy full-size models, regardless of engine size. So it's true, if you pick up a 1964 back to 58 Chevy, you're going to see an X frame, and in the middle of that frame, a plate. Under that plate is going to be a support bearing, which merges the two halves of the two-piece driveshaft. Now, one exception to all of this stuff is 1965, when you could still get the 409 in a full-size Chevy, but that year, 1965, Chevy went away from the X-frame to a perimeter frame, a Coke bottle frame, and those used a one-piece driveshaft. So 65 409 cars used their own specific driveshaft type. Now you know. Okay, moving from drive shafts to wheels, let's go to fact number 71. Excluding certain airport limousines and commercial chassis models, all full-size post-war Chevrolet passenger cars used 5-lug hubs and wheels. The lone exception is the small fleet of NASCAR Black Widows built in 1957 with heavy-duty 6-lug hubs and wheels borrowed from the pickup truck parts bin. Assembled by Southern Engineering Development Corporation Operation, SEDCO, in Atlanta, Georgia, the 6-lug equipment solved the problem of rim and spindle failure that haunted earlier 5-lug Chevy stock cars. Contrary to lore, road racing Corvettes were never equipped with 6-lug wheels. And that whole thing, that Southern Engineering Development Corporation Operation, SEDCO, was a way for Chevrolet and General Motors to get around the AMA performance ban of 1957. In the 1950s, as more and more V8s hit the road and more young people got behind the wheel, well, there was a rash of car accidents and a lot of bad publicity. And as a result, all the Detroit car makers under the AMA, the Automobile Manufacturers Association, agreed to no longer sponsor racing. So to get around that, Chevrolet hired Smokey Yunick and others to create SEDCO, which then released these little race cars called the Black Widows. I think something like 12 were made. And again, they all had 6-lug wheels with heavy-duty guts to better resist those dirt tracks that were pounded on throughout the South. And by 1958, SEDCO was out of business, all done. But those Black Widow 57 Chevys are a legend in their own time. Moving forward from 57 SEDCO Chevys to the SS454 Monte Carlo. Fact 72 reads, the 1970 and 71 Monte Carlo SS454 was factory equipped with G67 Superlift self-leveling rear shock absorbers. Designed to maintain rear ride height regardless of passenger and cargo load, the air shocks used an electric air compressor and storage tank mounted to the left front inner fender and rear ride height sensors to keep them properly pressurized. Non-SS Monte Carlo buyers could get the Superlift shocks for an extra $89.55. Yep, there you have it. Every SS454 Monte Carlo will have an unusual electric pump under the hood to keep those factory air shocks pumped up. Again, it was RPO G67, and for mere $89.55, non-Supersport buyers could also get the Superlift shocks. All right, moving from shock absorbers to the 63 Z11 Impala and its brakes, we go to fact 73. Built before the availability of corporate Delco Moraine disc brakes, All 1963 Z11 Impalas featured 11-inch manual drum brakes with metallic linings. To speed the escape of heat, the backing plates have screened vents. Because metallic brakes are notoriously ineffective when wet, Chevrolet shipped the Z11s with bolt-on aluminum vent cover plates to bar the entry of water. The use of road race-oriented metallic brakes is unusual for a car specifically intended for drag strip competition, where braking demands are minimal. Yeah, the Z11 Impalas of 1963, I think something like 22, something like that, were made, featured, or maybe 57. Anyway, it's a small number, well under 100. Those cars were built with aluminum fenders, hoods, bumpers, and yes, special drum brakes with those drilled backing plates. And it is kind of weird. It is possible that the high-performance team in charge of coming up with the mechanical package that was the Z11 were probably well-rounded guys who saw drag racing in a straight line as a small part of the car's duty. They also incorporated road race stuff, and it is true, some Z11 stuff was used in NASCAR, but NASCAR mandated steel fenders, so you couldn't use the Z11 lightweight nose on a NASCAR superspeedway. So it is kind of funny that they came with NASCAR brakes complete with backing plates with vents to allow heated air to escape, but in fact, on a drag strip, those brakes barely got hot because, well, it's only a quarter mile. Okay, moving to the rear suspension of the 63 Z11 Impala, we go to fact 74. Contrary to popular belief, 1963 Z11 Impalas did not receive any extra traction-enhancing rear suspension links. Some erroneous reports claim the stock passenger side rear upper control arm was joined by a twin mounted on the driver's side. The only modifications of this sort were made after retail delivery. In particular, Bill Jenkins' 63 Black Arrow car is still alive, and that car has been modified by Bill Jenkins back in the day with a second upper control arm. But from the factory, the Z11s had the same 3-link suspension in the rear that you'll find under a standard 283 Impala. Keep in mind, of course, the Z11s were meant primarily for straight-line drag racing, where they saw duty against the Super Duty Catalinas, the 421s, the Mopar Max Wedges with 413s and 426s, and of course the Ford 406 and 427 cars. And again, one thing that was kind of sad, by March of 1963, really early in the campaign, GM corporate said, no more racing, end of the Z11, and that was it. I can only imagine how cool things and how crazy things would have gotten if General Motors didn't pull its own plug in March of 63. We'll never know. All right, let's move up a couple of decades to the early 1980s for fact 75. Rear axles in Camaros. Here goes. Indestructible Dana rear axles were only used under muscle car era Mopars, right? Not so fast. In 1985, the Dana 44 differential became standard equipment in manual transmission Corvettes. A little brother to the Mopar spec 9 3/4-inch Dana 60, which also saw plenty of use in light trucks from every manufacturer, the Dana 44's 8.5-inch ring gear was fully capable of handling the Tuneport 350's hefty 330 foot-pounds of torque. A year earlier, in April of 1984, Chevrolet announced availability of a Dana 44 live rear axle assembly for third-generation Camaro and Firebird applications. But, unlike the Corvette unit, this Dana was strictly an over-the-counter item, part number 14044855, if you want to buy one with your time machine. The retail price was $940. Built around a specific case intended solely to accept the F-Car's unique traction arm, its existence suggests Chevrolet was likely toying with a factory-installed Dana 45 driveline. The Dana 44 crate axle is not to be confused with the extra-duty Australian-sourced 7 and 7.5-inch Borg-Warner 9-bolt used in 1987. So there you have it. We talked about this on the last episode. The Dana 44 was played with at the GM Proving Grounds as a possible way for the Tuneport 350 to maybe get a manual transmission, or the 305 to grow more power, because the stock 7.62 just wasn't cutting it. In fact, the side gears and the posi units and those things are known to explode if you put slicks on, say, a Tuneport 305 Camaro, especially a 5-speed car. You can blow that axle up real good. But with the Dana 44 waiting in the wings, well, that was the solution. But unfortunately, you paid an extra $940, and you put it in by yourself. Okay, moving along. Fact 76 takes us back to the late 1950s and how Chevrolet solved brake fade on its superstar Corvette. Okay, fact 76 takes us back 20 years to the late 1950s and the Corvette. The only way to tell a 1958 RPO 684 big brake Corvette from a pedestrian model is to look at the dual air scoops mounted beneath the headlights. On regular Corvettes, the chrome scoop bezels terminate against flat panels painted black to trick the eye. By contrast, on RPO 684 cars, the block material is cut away to feed air to elaborate full-length ducts. Invisible from outside the car, the rigid fiberglass ducting is bonded to the fenders above the front tires, then continues through the rocker panels beneath the doors. Flexible scoops attached to the vented rear backing plates catch the flowing air and direct it into the rear brake drums. Priced at $780, 20% of the total cost of the car, the upcharged help pay for the extra hand labor needed to install the incredibly complex system of ducts. The front drum brakes used much simpler rubber flaps, commonly referred to as elephant ears, to grab passing air. Unlike the factory-installed rear brake plumbing, the front ducts were placed in the trunk for dealer installation. And these 1957, 58, and 59 big brake Corvettes are gold. They're basically the legends of the first-gen Corvette. And the big thing was, before the 1965 adoption of disc brakes on Corvettes, Duntov and his engineers fought brake fade on road courses like Bridgehampton or any of the places these cars ran. Whenever the racers came up into a corner, that big V8 had to be slowed down, and those 12-inch drums just weren't up to the job. So as good as they tried, they found that moving air over the drums was as good as changing the material of the drums or the shoes. So they went through all kinds of maneuvers to duct air, including cutting away the front of the car to create these ducts that ran through the body. And this stuff was invisible unless you really looked for it. But big brake Corvettes today, real ones, are worth their weight in gold. Okay, let's continue with more early Corvette tech with fact number 77, which reads, 1959 saw the addition of factory traction bars on all Corvettes. To combat rear spring wrap-up and axle hop under full throttle, which plagued Corvettes since the switch to V8 power in 1955, Duntov's crew added a pair of tubular steel radius rods running forward from the top of the axle housing to articulated frame mounts. The traction bars were standard on all Corvettes until the arrival of the all-new 1963 Stingray. And of course, the thing with the Stingray was independent rear suspension, which you can modify for traction bars, but it's a whole different bag. But yeah, if you look on the top of the axle on these 1959 up Corvettes, you will see that rod. You know, most traction bars are mounted under the axle from, say, the spring plate to the underside of the front leaf spring perch. But the trouble with that is ground clearance. You know, one of the things, if you're building cars in mass production, you have to take into account that people might drive their Corvettes over logs or over curbs. And if those traction bars were mounted on the bottom, they might be broken or damaged, and that might lead to bigger problems in the courtroom. So as a result, for production, the traction bars were mounted on top of the axles over the leaf springs. Okay, let's move to the other end of the early Corvette with fact 78. The 265 cubic inch small block V8 might have been the big breakthrough for 1955 on the 150, 210, and Bel Air passenger cars, but few remember it was also the year Chevrolet switched from the antiquated dive-prone kingpin front suspension used in 54 to a modern ball joint configuration with twin A-shaped control arms. This basic layout was in use for the following 4 decades. Ironically, Corvettes retained the kingpin configuration until 1963. It's true, it probably came down to cost cutting, but the trouble with the kingpin arrangement is when you hit the brakes, weight transfers forward, and the arc taken by the upper and lower control arms can do one of two things. It can either allow the car to nose down and become tail light, where then the tail of the car swings around and you spin out, or you can design in something called anti-dive characteristics, which is what the kingpin suspension didn't have, but the ball joint suspension did. Anti-dive fights the tendency for the weight of the car to squash the nose, which then helps preserve weight on the rear tires. So again, the Corvette suffered with kingpin dive-prone braking all the way till 1962. Meanwhile, of course, the passenger cars had far better ball joint suspension. And that was one of the things that Duntov was also fighting. But again, the bean counters called the shots. Don't believe otherwise. Okay, let's continue with the early Corvette tech here with fact 79. Pity the owner of a big brake Corvette who is missing rare parts. We all know the car featured special cast iron brake drums with integral heat dissipating fins. But did you know the drums installed on 56 cars are unique and have shorter fins? They don't wrap around the front face of the drum like the 57 to early 59 drums do. Again, the devil's in the details. If you have 58 drums on your 56 big brake car, the judges will just as quickly ignore them and take full points off. I mean, the fact is you found big brake drums with the fins on them, but too bad, buddy, they're the wrong ones. You might as well have not gone through the trouble. That's why I say that people who restore early Corvettes, in particular big brake Fuelies and big brake dual quad cars, are a special type of people. They must love pain. Anybody following along at home will see that my Steve Magnanti's 1001 Muscle Car Facts bounces all over the place. So as we go from fact 78 or 79 about Corvettes, fact 80 is about Chevelles. Here goes. Look under any big block Chevelle and you'll note a series of rectangular metal tabs have been welded to the rear lower control arms. They're present to stiffen the stock stamped U-channel arms so they don't deflect and contribute to wheel hop. This inexpensive trick was also employed on Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac A-body muscle cars. And what we're talking about here is the fact that Chevrolet and the other divisions utilize the stock lower control arm on all A-body Chevelles. But with the big block, they added these tabs to kind of turn it into a tube without coming up with a different part number and the cost that would incur. These tabs are generally found on SS456s, although F41 heavy-duty suspension cars with small blocks could also be had with these special lower control arms. And again, by adding those tabs, the arm goes from a 3-sided piece to a 4-sided piece, which makes it stiffer, again, better suited to deflecting axle hop and controlling wheel contact with the road. As we go from fact 80 to fact 81, my book, Steve Magnanti's 1001 Muscle Car Facts, transitions to number crunching and press commentary. So these next factoids will be about that, what the press had to say, and some statistics. Fact 81 reads, Chevrolet called the Camaro a car for all seasons and packed each year's sales book with as many as 81 regular production options, plus another 41 dealer-installed options on standby. Peak production was 282,571 cars in 1979. The leanest year for Camaro production was 2001, with just 29,009 built. In comparison, Mustang's best year was 1966, with 607,568 made. Its worst year was 1992, with 79,096 cars built. Kind of goes to the point that the Mustang pretty much always led the Camaro in the sales race. I mean, after all, the Mustang was first, coming out in 64 and a half as a 1965 car. Camaro played catch-up for 67 onward. But again, with the best year for Camaro was 282,571, about a third of Mustang's best year in 1966. Either way, Mustang or Camaro, I love them both, and I bet you do too. Okay, moving from Camaro and Mustang production figures, we go to fact 82, which focuses on the 1965 model year and full-size Chevys. Here we go. 1965 was a year of transition for big block, full-size Biscayne, Bel Air, and Impala models. Though the entire car was redesigned from the frame up, cars built before April received the obsolete W Series 409, probably as a means of using unsold inventory. Cars built after mid-April were available with the Mark IV 396 big block. A paltry 2,828 409s were installed in full-size Chevys. By contrast, 57,292 cars were built with the new 396 big block, 1,838 being of the fierce 425 horsepower L78 variety. Now that's telling. 57,292 396s, but only 1838 were the L78. Now, the L78 was a special engine. It had high compression, 11-to-1 versus 10-to-1, a solid lifter camshaft versus the hydraulic cam, an aluminum intake versus cast iron, and a Holley 4-barrel carburetor versus a Rochester Quadrajet. So the lower performance 396s, while they were peppy, were nothing like the solid lifter 425 horsepower L78. It took somebody with a real sense of humor and a mechanical touch to live with a 425 horse 396, because about every month or so you had to set the lifters. Another example of the big crazy engine being vastly outsold by milder versions is fact number 83. New for 1970, the Chevelle SS454 RPO Z15 was available in two strengths, the 360 horsepower LS5 and the wild 450 horsepower LS6. Breaking with Chevelle SS tradition, where mild base engines handily outsell solid cam halo offerings, 177 more buyers chose the LS6 than the LS5, 4,475 versus 4,298. Those thrill seekers paid an extra $263.30 for the LS6 and the keys to the highest factory-rated engine of the muscle car era. That's right, with 450 horsepower, the LS6 was the highest factory-rated engine. Now, the one thing we all know now is that pretty much everybody was calling it short with the power. The 426 Street Hemi was rated at 425 horsepower at 5,000 RPM, or 580 horsepower at 5,500 RPM. And what they were kind of going up against was increasing scrutiny by lawmakers. The Senate started to realize these baby boomers, these teenage kids who were driving these muscle cars, were hitting trees and hitting other cars and costing the insurance company a lot of money, let alone a public safety hazard. Now, I'm going to guess that's not you. I was born in 1964, so I wasn't part of the crisis, but I can only imagine a kid leaving a Doors concert with a head full of Timothy Leary, getting into a Hemi-Cuda, spinning out in traffic, and becoming an insurance statistic. But with that said, it's pretty surprising that the LS6, the big dog, the 450 horsepower 454, outsold the milder LS5 by 177 units. I mean, either way, about 4,500 of these cars were sold. Much larger numbers of the SS396 were also sold in 1970, and that's the one that most kids bought because they couldn't really afford the insurance surcharge that came with buying the Z15 SS454. Were you one of them? Moving from fact 83 about the SS454 on to fact 84, we get into the world of statistics, which can lend an insight into why some cars lived and some cars died. Here it reads, whether or not the Camaro killed the Corvair is an interesting question. Before the Camaro's debut in 1967, with 220,917 sold, Corvair sales averaged 230,000 cars per year, with a high of 292,531 in 1962 and a low of 103,743 cars in 1966. In 1967, as Camaros basked in new car glory, Corvair sales tumbled to 27,253. But the suffering wasn't over. 1968 production sagged to 15,399, and as Chevy pulled the plug in 1969, a mere 6,000 Corvairs found buyers. But before accusing Camaro of fratricide, killing its brother, let's not forget the 1962 introduction of the Chevy 2 Nova, a much simpler car than the exotic air-cooled Corvair, and one better suited to take on competing subcompact offerings such as Falcon, Lark, Rambler, and Valiant. And then there's Ralph Nader's 1965 book, Unsafe at Any Speed. Really, could any vehicle survive in the marketplace after such a broadside of largely unwarranted negative publicity? Hug the next Corvair you see. They deserve it. Okay. Moving from whether or not the Camaro killed the Corvair or not, we go to fact 85, a breakdown of transmission and engine take rates in the new Camaro. It reads, as exciting as it is to row through the gears, only 2 in 10 1968 Camaro buyers took the 4-speed manual transmission. And as fun as a big V8 can be, just over 2 in 10 1968 Camaro buyers settle for an inline 6-cylinder engine. The jump to the base V8 adding exactly $100 to the window sticker, $24.21 versus $25.21. And that tells us right there, the 3-speed manual and the automatic were much more commonly seen in Camaros than we give them credit for today. When I see these cars at Barrett-Jackson, probably a good half of them have been transformed from 3-speed manuals with 6 cylinders into SS396s with 4 speeds. And you really have to keep your eye open to see what you're really looking at. And when it comes to the engines, of course, 1968, we see that 20% of people went for the 6-banger, 80% went for the V8. And I get it. 6-cylinder Camaro is kind of a disappointing car. It looks so sexy, so exciting, but with that 230 cubic inch 6-banger, or 250 in 1969, the looks just weren't matched by the performance. Moving on to fact number 86, more interesting statistics. Contrary to logical assumption, the 1967 arrival of the Camaro did not hurt same-year Chevy 2 Nova sales. Chevy 2 accounted for 4.9% of total Chevrolet division sales in 1965, growing to 5.7% in 1966, and holding steady at 5.6% in 1967, despite sharing showroom floor space with the attention-grabbing Camaro. The greater harm was done to Ford's Mustang, sales of which dropped from 607,568 in '66 to 472,121 in 1967, a radical jump. Suddenly, the original pony car wasn't the only game in town. Speaking of the only game in town, you're listening to the Steve Maggs Muscle Car Show, the only automotive podcast that's packed with the facts you want to hear. This concludes Show 5, but we'll be back on Wednesday with Show 6 and a look at Camaro Z28 production figures, where the half-millionth Corvette ended up, and a whole bunch more. For my executive producer, Chris Roberts, until Wednesday, hasta mañana. The Steve Maggs Muscle Car Show podcast is brought to you by High Octane Classics, the Northeast's largest muscle car and supercar dealership, located at 143 Washington Street in Auburn, Massachusetts. High Octane Classics buys and sells and services muscle cars and exotics. Call them at 508-859-4515.